On a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1953, a young woman named An stood in the middle of a huge sugarcane grove in an isolated forest in Papua New Guinea. And around her were all her relatives and neighbors, and they were all there to mourn the loss of An's sister, whose name was Tan. She had passed away 3 days earlier from a very mysterious illness that people in An's village called kuru. And in their language, the word kuru meant trembling. Now, keep in mind, this particular mystery illness that was called kuru only affected the people in An and Tan's village. This is like a hyper-specific illness that only happened inside of this little forest to these people. But An and the rest of the people in her village had seen this happen over and over and over again every year. And so they knew what happened when you got kuru because it was always the same. As soon as you began to tremble, that was kind of like the first sign. 1 year or so after that moment, you lose control of all the muscles in your body until you die. And so in Tan's case, so An's sister, she had watched this happen exactly as it did for everybody else that ever got this illness. She started with the tremors, and then before long, she couldn't even stand up or walk around. And then finally, her sister lost control of the muscles in her throat. And so she couldn't eat despite being hungry. And so ultimately she died of starvation, which is like one of the worst ways to die. It's incredibly slow and very, very painful. And so ever since Tan's death 3 days earlier, the village had been performing all these rituals and prayers in an attempt to assist Tan's spirit on its way into the afterlife. And this type of very involved funeral was absolutely customary in An's culture. An and her family and all of these villagers were members of the Foray people, who were native to Papua New Guinea, which is an island just north of Australia. And in 1953, when the story is taking place, the Foray people numbered about 11,000 people. And remember, they live in a very isolated forest. They are basically cut off from the world for the most part. But they were beginning to fear that they were going to go extinct because of kuru. Every year, the Foray people lost 200 people to kuru. And for the most part, the victims were women, like disproportionately so, which made it even more likely that the Foray people would go extinct. Because if you lose all the women, you can't have any more kids. And in fact, by 1953, so many women had died from kuru that by this point, there were 3 times as many men as there were women. In fact, the leading cause of death for Foray women was kuru. But the Foray people did not view kuru as just an illness. They actually viewed it as a curse. In fact, that was completely accepted that that is exactly what it was. This is not like getting the cold. Somebody did this to you, like a sorcerer somewhere, some unnamed sorcerer that's like coming into the forest is targeting these women and cursing them with kuru. And so the Foray people put on these really elaborate funerals, mostly to ward off these dark magic sorcerers that were casting kuru spells. And so the Foray people believed that if they just nailed the funeral procedure for somebody who has just died from kuru, the kind of 3-day long, all these rituals and prayers they have to do, if the village is able to nail it perfectly, then the deceased who's passed away from kuru, so in this case, An's sister Tan, her spirit, as a result of this perfect funeral, would be able to kind of rise up and actually seek revenge on the sorcerer who killed the person. And so these funerals were basically like kind of taking the dead, rising their spirit, and sending them off to go kill the sorcerer. And so An and the rest of her villagers, they went through this very elaborate process for An's sister, Tan, and at the end of it, they did feel like they had really nailed it. And so they felt confident that Tan's spirit was going to rise up and get her revenge. A few weeks after An's sister's funeral, An was standing over an open fire and she was cooking some pork and sweet potatoes. And as she went to flip the meat over, she reached her hand out and she noticed her hand was trembling, which is the first sign of someone with kuru. Now, An told herself that, oh no, I don't have kuru. It's just because I was working really hard today and I'm tired, like that's all it is. But she knew deep down she may have been cursed. An did her best to kind of hide her trembling hands. However, after about a month from that first time she noticed her hand shaking, she noticed she wasn't really able to stand up without kind of losing her balance because her legs were starting to tremble. And finally, when she basically couldn't even stand up without assistance, this is again only 1 month after that first tremble, she knew she had kuru. And An already knew that there was absolutely nothing anybody in her village could do to stop this from killing her. Kuru was a 100% death sentence. And so if you got Kuru, it's like the whole village just began prepping for your death because they had to be ready to do this big ritualistic funeral. And so imagine that. You have this mystery illness or curse or whatever you want to think it is, and you're just counting down the days until you die. But for An, even though she had seen this happen so many times before and just kind of knew there's nothing she could do, she couldn't stand the idea of having this horrible, slow, painful death. And so she decided, you know what? I'm going to do something drastic that basically nobody else had done before who had Kuru. So for context, at this time, the Foray people had been totally isolated from other people in the world for thousands of years. They basically lived in this little part of Papua New Guinea in the forest, and nobody else contacted them. They were totally isolated. However, starting in the 1950s, some Australian colonists and researchers and police actually began kind of making their way in and around the Foray people's area. So they were making contact, albeit not necessarily direct contact, but the Foray people were seeing basically white people wandering around in and around their forest from time to time. And it was always very shocking when they would see these people because they dressed completely differently, they looked totally different. I mean, it's like two worlds totally colliding. And generally speaking, An and the rest of the people in her village, they did not like having these Australian people kind of wandering around. But An is thinking, you know, the people in my village, the Foray people, they have no solutions for me. So maybe these Australian people that have kind of popped up, maybe they have some answers about what I can do to stop myself from dying from this horrible curse. Keep in mind, by going out and seeking help from these outsiders, it was like An would be breaking a huge custom. This is so taboo for the Foray people, and very likely, even if she was able to find a solution from these outsiders, it's not clear if she would have been welcomed back into her village. And so this is a truly desperate measure she's taking. But she really felt like she had no choice. So, even as her body trembled from Kuru, An managed to stand up using a stick, and she began kind of hobbling her way quietly and discreetly out of her village, something that she really never did. And eventually, after hobbling her way out of sight of the Foray people, she began making her way through the woods, and she eventually came to a clearing where there was this house. And it was obvious this is not a house that the Foray people have built. This is somebody from the outside who's built something kind of near where they were living. And so An wandered up to this house, not really sure what to do, but she went up and knocked on the door, and a second later it opened up. And it's this Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt, who actually An had seen before. He had been coming through her village a couple of times, attempting to interview people to learn more about the Foray people. She knew that nobody wanted to talk to him, but she had seen him before. And so she was relieved. This is someone that I'm somewhat familiar with. And so as Ronald is staring back at her, and Ronald's pretty tall and skinny, he's got glasses on, he's dressed like a typical Australian in the 1950s, and he's looking at An, and An begins to try to tell him what's going on with her. And as she began to talk, the words she was saying were coming out all garbled, and she realized that the Kuru curse was now affecting her throat, the muscles in her neck, and she was not able to speak. But as it happened, Ronald, who was very familiar with the Foray people, he could tell, based on just the way she was acting and how desperate she looked, that very likely this woman was here because she believed she had Kuru. And Ronald, who had learned about Kuru after studying the Foray people, he had done some research on it, and he believed it was entirely psychosomatic, that this was not an actual illness. Basically, he believed Kuru was acute hysteria, that these Foray people were just going crazy and convincing themselves that they had this illness, and I guess that kind of manifested their death a year later. And so Ronald interrupted An, who again is struggling to talk, and he was able to communicate to her in her language that you do not have Kuru, you are hysterical, this is in your head, and you should go now. And then he shut the door on her. And An had no idea what to do. She was embarrassed. She was terrified that maybe somebody from her village had seen her come out here. And so just trembling and feeling so alone and so scared, she turned around and just went back to her village. 9 months later, An's condition had severely deteriorated. She basically was following exactly the process of every other person she had seen with Kuru. She had lost virtually all the control of her body. She could barely sip water. She was feeling absolutely horrible. I mean, she knew she was closing in on death. And she had not gone back out to try to get help from outsiders. That interaction with Ronald had kind of destroyed her hope. And so she did go back and just was kind of waiting to die, just like everybody else in her village did. But for An, the physical symptoms of Kuru that she was experiencing were undoubtedly terrible. But they were not as bad, at least to An, as the other side of Kuru. So in addition to referring to this curse as Kuru, which meant trembling, sometimes Foray people would refer to this curse, this illness, as the laughing death. And it's because during the terminal stage, so the end stage of Kuru, when you're just about to die, you just begin laughing. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about. This is not an actual laugh. You're not thinking something's funny. It's like you could be weeping and totally depressed because you know you're gonna die, but you keep hysterically laughing, which makes your whole body sore from constantly laughing over and over again. And An was beginning to experience that. She would be weeping and laughing at the same time. And think about this, everybody else who's in the village, they know what this means. And so their preparations for her death are only getting more and more ramped up. They're getting ready for the big ritualistic funeral they're going to give to An. And so An, as she's hysterically laughing, is fully aware that everybody's just waiting for her to die. And finally, just a few weeks after she had begun the laughing side of Kuru, An would pass away, almost exactly 1 year from when she first noticed the trembling in her hand when she was cooking over that fire. If you don't know this, late last year, we launched a brand new, strange, dark, and mysterious show called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. And so far, people love it. It is a free weekly show where each week we explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. Topics discussed on the show range from obscure diseases and freak occurrences to totally weird medical mishaps that sometimes result in big, amazing discoveries and other times result in just unimaginable suffering and death. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you really ought to give Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries a try. To start listening, go look up and follow Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform, and boom, you're in. You got yourself a new weekly show. But if you're super impatient, like I am, and you can't wait a whole week to get a new episode, well, with your Prime membership, you can listen to an entire batch of 8 episodes at once, because we release them 8 at a time on Amazon Music. Also, on Amazon Music, there are no ads. And if all this was not enough to sell you on maybe giving the show a try, well, then stick around at the end of this video, and I'll play you a sneak peek from our newest episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. After An's death, more and more people just kept on getting Kuru. And over the next 7 years, it was like clockwork. 200 plus 4A people died from Kuru every year, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. It just became a part of their lives. And again, they kept getting closer and closer to being extinct. It was this really terrifying time. 7 years after An's death, so in 1961, a medical anthropologist named Shirley Lindenbaum was sitting in her office at City University in New York reading over old scientific articles. And as she was just kind of flipping through them, she noticed there was an article from an Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt, the same guy who had turned An away and told her, no, you don't have Kuru, that's not real, it's psychosomatic. And in this article, Ronald outlined these symptoms that the 4A people were exhibiting that obviously were not real. They had tremors, loss of muscle control, and huge mood swings. But Ronald was like, it's all in their head. It's not a real disease. But to Shirley, as she's reading this, she's thinking, why has Ronald decided this has to be psychosomatic? These symptoms seem like a real disease, like a neurological condition. Something must be attacking their brains, causing them to have these symptoms and then die. But when Shirley, just out of curiosity, began to do some additional research on the Kuru disease, or whatever you want to call it, she discovered that there was basically no real research other than Ronald's about this weird illness. And so she decided, you know what, there's a gap in the research, and I'm going to fill it. I'm going to figure out what's going on with the 4A people and this weird thing called Kuru. So the following summer, when Shirley finally had some time, she left New York and flew to Papua New Guinea, and she made her way into the forests to contact the 4A people. And eventually she reached some of these small villages that contained 4A people, and the 4A people, even if they didn't necessarily embrace Shirley, many of them were open to at least speaking to her and talking about their culture, their customs, their history, and of course, talking about Kuru, this curse. And eventually, Shirley made her way into this one particular 4A village where she actually saw a white man just walking around in this village. So he really stood out. And so immediately, Shirley walked up to this guy and he introduced himself as Dr. Michael Alpers. And he told Shirley he had been living in these villages with the 4A people for several months because he was studying Kuru. He wanted to figure out, what's actually causing it, because he also felt very skeptical at the idea that this is just psychosomatic. That did not seem very plausible. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers were totally aligned, and they're like, hey, let's swap notes and do this together. And so Shirley began telling Dr. Alpers about what she had learned so far, and she said that when she showed up in Papua New Guinea, she believed what this was, what Kuru was a genetic brain disease, meaning it would be passed down from, parent to child and so on and so forth. But she quickly discovered that after conducting research and talking to the 4A people in these villages, that was not the case. This was not something that went from parent to child. Instead, Kuru appeared to spread amongst tight-knit social groups within these villages, which seemed to indicate this was actually a contagious disease, not a genetic one. And so she told Dr. Alpers that now her working theory was that Kuru was actually a contagious type of encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. But Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that did not explain why so many victims of Kuru were female. And Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that, I've been around loads of people with Kuru and I don't have it, so how can it be contagious? Dr. Alpers agreed with everything Shirley was saying, and in fact had come to a similar conclusion himself, which meant he also had the same questions. Why only women, and why wasn't he getting it? But he told Shirley that when he began trying to answer this question, he discovered that actually, in addition to lots of women getting Kuru, also lots of kids got Kuru. Not necessarily parent to child, but also children in these villages seemed to be slightly more susceptible to getting Kuru than men. And in fact, Dr. Alpers told Shirley that right now there was a 12-year-old boy who was in the final stage of Kuru, so the laughing stage, the terminal stage, and because this boy's parents knew their son was going to die, they were so desperate and grief-stricken that when Dr. Alpers came by and offered to do an autopsy on their son when he passed to try to learn more, the parents agreed, even though that meant totally breaking 4A custom. So this was like major taboo decision. But again, the 4A people are getting more and more desperate as they go closer and closer to the brink of extinction from Kuru. A few days later, Dr. Alpers found Shirley, and he told her that the 12-year-old boy had passed away, and so now it was time to conduct the autopsy. And so he led Shirley to a clearing in the woods that was kind of far away from the eyes of the villagers, and there was a makeshift autopsy table with this boy's body on it. And while Shirley really could not stand to watch this actually happen, she did go over after Dr. Alpers had opened up the boy's skull, revealing his brain. And he yelled to her, hey, you have to come over here and look at this. And so Shirley walked over and she looked down, and even though she had not seen a human brain before right in front of her, she knew right away there's something terribly wrong with that brain. His brain was completely shriveled up and covered in holes, as if like a worm had drilled through his brain. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers immediately knew this brain has to be sent off for further testing because something's happening here that's not psychosomatic. This is a real disease that is killing these people. About a year later, Shirley was back home in New York in her office when she received a letter from a research team at the United States National Institutes of Health, or NIH for short. And the NIH is one of the largest medical research facilities in the world. And it was where Shirley and Dr. Alpers had sent off that boy's brain for further study. And so by getting this letter, Shirley knew she was going to get information about whatever they discovered in this boy's brain. And so she ripped it open and pulled out the report and began reading. And the researchers said they had spent the last year, studying this brain tissue. And while they still didn't really understand how Kuru even happened and what caused it, was it a virus or an infection? They didn't know, but they had discovered something about how Kuru spread. During one of their experiments, the NIH researchers had injected some tissue from this boy's brain into a chimpanzee, and very quickly, that chimpanzee developed Kuru. And so this told the researchers that yes, Kuru was contagious, and it spread through infected brain tissue. But how one person's infected brain got into another person's brain was the big mystery. But at least they had found something. But as Shirley read this, Because she had done all that research when she went into the forests of Papua New Guinea and spoke to all these 4A people, she had learned a lot about what they did on a day-to-day basis and, what their various customs and rituals were. And she actually knew exactly how something like this could happen, something that only the 4A people were doing. During her research in Papua New Guinea, Shirley had learned that 4A people believe all humans have 5 distinct souls. There was that one soul that 4A people believe they could basically summon up out of a deceased person that would then go avenge that person's death. So think about how all those people who died from Kuru, they believed that was a curse from some sorcerer. And so a big part of that funeral process was to call out that soul to go avenge their death, go find the sorcerer and kill them. But that was just one soul. There were 4 others. And of these 4 others, there was one called the Quila, which was the most dangerous. Quila meant flesh in the 4A people's language, and this soul was like a manifestation of death and decay, because that's what our flesh does. It just kind of gradually dies all the time. And so they looked at the flesh as being a really bad thing. And so they believed after someone died, their flesh needed to be stored properly. Otherwise, it would pollute the air and cause more death and decay for other people that were still alive. And the safest place, according to the 4A people, for the Quila to be stored, so human flesh, was inside of a woman's body. And the reason for this is 4A people believe women's bodies are much more resilient than men's. And so if anybody could withstand holding Quila inside of them, it would be the women. But there was a very specific process that the 4A women had to follow in order to kind of put this Quila inside of themselves. And multiple 4A women had explained this totally bizarre process to Shirley when she was out there talking to the people in the village. The way it worked is a few days after a 4A member has passed away, this huge feast is prepared. Except the feast only consists of the Quila. Basically, the person who is dead is chopped up and prepared by the women, like their entire body gets consumed. Now, keep in mind, anybody hearing about this who's not a member of the 4A people would be like, oh my God, that's horrible. But to 4A people, this ritualistic cannibalism was actually an act of love. The idea was by having these women consume the Quila, consuming the dead person, you're protecting the living because you don't want the Quila out and about polluting the air, and you are respecting the dead. But remember, Kuru got spread through infected brain tissue. And it just so happened that during these funeral feasts, when they were consuming the Quila, the brain of the deceased person was an absolute delicacy. And so the brain was reserved for close female relatives of the deceased person. And so during An's sister's funeral, so when Ton passed, what do you think An ate? She ate Ton's brain. And then also, critically, Shirley had learned that a lot of these women who were given the brain, this delicacy during these funerals, they would often sneak little pieces of the brain and hand it out to kids as like a little treat. They would take the brain and eat it. Nobody knew. That's why the kids were also getting Kuru. And so a few years after this incredible discovery by Shirley about how Kuru was being passed along, the Australian colonial government banned the practice of ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea. Basically, they were telling the 4A people to stop eating the dead. It's what's killing you. And the 4A people, who were very desperate to stop being killed by Kuru, they took to it, stopped eating each other, and so Kuru was virtually eradicated, and the 4A population, instead of sliding towards extinction, actually began to grow really fast. And today, the total population has at least doubled. And also, just to close this out, one final note is it took until 1990 to actually figure out what was going on inside of these people's bodies when they had Kuru. Because back in the 60s, when they figured out how not to get Kuru, nobody understood what was even happening. It was just like, don't eat other people and you'll be okay, but that's all they knew. And while the process in the human body that caused Kuru remained a mystery for many decades after Shirley's big discovery, in the 1990s, researchers did finally figure out what's actually going on. Basically, somebody with Kuru has these proteins in their brain called prions that fold wrong into the wrong shape and then cannot function properly. This loss of protein function rapidly kills brain cells, which in turn shrivels up the brain and causes all those holes all over it. Okay, here is the clip from our newest episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Enjoy. A 40-year-old man stood next to his teenage daughter in a hospital room, clutching her hand as she lay there unconscious on a gurney. A flurry of doctors and nurses moved all around them, securing an oxygen mask over the girl's nose and jabbing her arms with needles. The father couldn't believe this was really happening. Just an hour ago, he'd come home to find his daughter passed out on the floor of the kitchen. Her face and neck were totally beet red. He didn't know what had happened, but his best guess was that maybe she had accidentally overheated the oven while making food, and then when she opened up the oven door, a rush of heat came out and it burned her. He didn't know what else could make her look so sunburned on such a cloudy December day. A nurse put her arms on the father's shoulders and told him he needed to step aside. So the father squeezed his daughter's hand one more time, then let the nurse guide him out of the hospital room. The nurse told the father that his daughter's kidneys were failing. They were going to rush her to the intensive care unit for emergency dialysis. The father blinked, trying to process what the nurse had just told him. He didn't understand how his daughter's burned skin could lead to kidney failure. People died from that. He watched helplessly as the medical team wheeled his daughter's gurney out of the room and down the hallway. And as they disappeared through a set of double doors, it hit him that he might have just seen his little girl alive for the last time. The father prayed that her doctors could figure out what was wrong with her before it was too late. Late one night in 1870, a Harvard medical student named James Adams walked down a dark street toward the gate of a cemetery in the quiet town of Malden, Massachusetts. And with him was his classmate William, who was carrying an unlit lantern. Once they reached the gate, they both stopped and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and then they helped each other climb over the gate. And once they were on the other side, they took off running straight down the cemetery path. And eventually, after running for a minute, they got to the other side of the cemetery, and they came to a stop outside of a brick mausoleum that contained the remains of a man named Ephraim Gray, who had died 20 years earlier. So for years, James and William had been hearing all these rumors about this guy, Ephraim. In fact, many of their classmates had heard these rumors, and some people really believed they could be true. But tonight, James and William had snuck in here to this mausoleum to once and for all prove that those rumors were false. According to the rumors, when Ephraim was alive, so 20 years earlier, he'd been this very reclusive chemist who lived in a big house in the middle of town, and he had this one servant. And anytime people walked past his house, apparently they would always smell this really pungent chemical scent. And people believed that what Ephraim was doing in there to produce that smell was basically trying to come up with a potion that would make him immortal. He was basically running these strange experiments. However, clearly his experiments had not worked, because Ephraim had died anyway. But when he died, his one servant had told the mortician not to embalm him, which was very unusual at the time. This was not a normal request. The servant had said that, even though Ephraim's elixir had not actually succeeded in keeping him alive forever, it had been successful at making his physical body immortal. The servant said, apparently, Ephraim's body would never decay. And so this story had become sort of a local legend. And decades later, lots of people in the area, in particular in Harvard Medical School, students actually believed it might be true, or they at least pretended it could be true. It was fun to believe. But James, as much as he wanted to, go along with the story, logically he felt like there is simply no way there could be any truth to this story. As a medical student, he knew that even the very best embalming techniques would only preserve a dead body for a few weeks at most. So there was no way Ephraim's body, that had been dead now for 2 decades, was not a pile of bones by now. And tonight, they were going to go find out. James knelt down in front of the mausoleum where Ephraim was entombed, and William struck a match and lit the lantern he had brought with him. And immediately the light from the lantern, it illuminated the door that led into the mausoleum, and they saw it was sealed shut with a padlock. So James, who's knelt down right next to the door, he pulled out a small hammer and a chisel, and he began to work on this lock. And eventually, he popped it open, he took the lock and put it on the ground, and then he stood up, and he and William were like, all right, here we go. And they pushed the door, and it slowly swung open. James stepped inside first, with William right behind him, holding up the lantern. And the space was cold and musty, and it was this kind of claustrophobic, all brick space that was covered in cobwebs. And on each side of the inside of this mausoleum were these big shelves with caskets sitting on each shelf. These were all different relatives of Ephraim's, and there were nameplates attached to each of these caskets. And so very quickly, James and William, they began looking, for the right casket that contained Ephraim. And eventually they found the right one, and they're sort of nervous at this point, but they're like, all right. And they got to either side of this casket, and together they pulled it off the shelf and put it down on the floor. And so James and William, they both went to the same side of the casket. And William, he's holding up his lantern, and they look at each other. They're like, all right, here we go. And James reaches down and he opens up the casket. And when they see what's inside, they can't believe it. Inside of this casket was definitely Ephraim's dead body. But even though Ephraim's clothing had clearly decayed into stringy brown mush, Ephraim himself did not look like he had been dead for 20 years. His skin was white and smooth, and there were no signs of decomposition on his body whatsoever. He was pristine. In fact, he looked like he was just sleeping, like he could just open his eyes and he'd be just fine. And so James and William are so spooked by this that they just instantly slam shut the casket, they turn, and they sprint out of the mausoleum, they flee the cemetery, and they pledge to never talk about this again. However, for the next few months, James just could not get the image of Ephraim's impossibly well-preserved body out of his head. Now, he still didn't believe the rumors that somehow, it's because of some potion that Ephraim drank that's made his body, immortal or something. But he read every chemistry book in the Harvard Library and could not find a scientific explanation for what he had seen. At the same time, James had another stress, which was he knew the Malden police were investigating the break-in at the mausoleum, and he was terrified that at some point, he and William were going to be found out. Desecrating a grave was a crime, and if James was actually arrested for it, he would get kicked out of medical school. But weeks turned into months, turned into years, and no police showed up at his door. So nobody figured out that he or William were involved in this break-in. And also, over this time, over these many years, he never figured out what actually had caused Ephraim's body to be that well preserved. But eventually, they just moved on with their lives. James graduated, he became a doctor, and he really just sort of forgot about the Ephraim thing. He just moved on. Until 30 years later, in 1900. At that point, James was in his 50s, and he was a successful doctor with his own medical practice in Boston. And one day, he was sitting in his office, catching up on some paperwork, when he heard a knock at the door. And so he called for whoever was out there to come in, and when the door opened up, he was very surprised to see a police officer. The officer told James that he was from the Malden Police Department, and he was looking into an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years earlier. Immediately, James felt sick to his stomach, and he was about to just start lying, saying he had nothing to do with it. But before he could say anything, the officer just said, look, multiple people in town have already told us that you and your friend William were responsible for that break-in. At this point, James knew he was caught, and there was no point in lying. Like, clearly, this officer knows what actually happened. And so James just rushed to explain sort of why they did it. He just said, look, like there were these rumors that the body of Ephraim Gray didn't decompose because he apparently drank some, immortality potion, and we thought it was crazy. So we broke in just to look at the body. We just opened the casket, looked at the body, we shut it, we ran out. That was it. But the officer, after hearing this story, just narrowed his eyes and stared at James like he didn't believe him. And then when the officer went on to explain exactly why now, 30 years later, they were taking another look at this break-in, when he explained that, James literally just could not believe what he was hearing. So it would turn out the Malden Cemetery was in the process of being relocated. So workers were going through and moving every single grave. But when they got to Ephraim Gray's casket, they noticed it was unusually light. So they opened it up and found it was empty. There was no sign that anybody except for James and William had ever tampered with that mausoleum. And so basically, James and William were being accused of stealing Ephraim's body. But they both swore they didn't do that. They said they just went in, they looked at the body, were shocked that it had not decomposed, and they ran out. They didn't take the body. But police, during their investigation, saw that nobody else tampered with this casket except for James and William. So where did the body go? It was almost like Ephraim had simply woken up one day, looking as fresh as ever, opened up his coffin, and just walked out. And despite all of James and William's skepticism and all their medical training, they couldn't help but wonder if maybe somehow Ephraim's immortality potion had finally kicked in. Gas, groceries, eating out, even on the tightest of budgets, there's really no escaping nor controlling them. But here's what you definitely can control: getting cash back every single time you fill up, you hit the grocery store, or go out to eat with the Upside app. One thing I really like about Upside is that it doesn't require me to change anything I'm already doing. So before I fill up, I just check the app to see what offers are available nearby. It only takes a few seconds. And getting cash back on gas I was already going to buy is always a nice bonus. Here's how it works. Open the Upside app, claim an offer, pay with your card like normal, and get paid. That's it. And yes, it's cash back, not points you'll never use, not credits that expire. It's real money you transfer straight to your bank account. Upside has given back $1 billion to its users. To find out how much you could earn, download the free Upside app and use promo code Mr. Ballin to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas using promo code Mr. Ballin. Available to U.S. consumers only. On the afternoon of January 28, 1945, an Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a wooden bench inside of a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. He was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors who were wearing white coats. All the lights were off in this church, and there was this religious hymn that was playing on a phonograph, which is like an early record player. And on the other side of the room, standing in front of a heavy locked door, were these two people, these two psychic mediums, who were twisting and groaning as if they were in pain. So the reason that Robert and everybody else, the other reporters, the doctors, were gathered here today was because of what was happening inside of that locked room. There was a man in there who was having his appendix removed. Now, usually, appendix removal was a routine surgery, and it would be performed without an audience and in a hospital instead of a back room in a church. But this operation was being performed by a very, very famous surgeon named Dr. Louise Gomes. And Dr. Gomes had only agreed to do this surgery under a couple of very odd conditions. So first, it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room, so that backed locked room, while he was working. Not even nurses or anesthesiologists, nobody. And third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with during this operation were those two psychic mediums standing outside the door. They wouldn't even be in the room with him, they'd be outside. And so after all these conditions were agreed to, before the surgery, the two mediums worked with the doctor to gather all the supplies and made sure they were in the back room. And then also they strapped the patient down to the operating table in the back room, and then they came out again. And then at that point, the reporter, Robert Cheney, and the other witnesses that were there to see this, the other reporters, the doctors, they helped board up all the windows of this back room of the church. And they also searched for any hidden passageways to make sure nobody could look into or sneak into or out of this back room, the operating room. And so eventually everything was ready, and Dr. Gomes and the patient were the only two people inside of this back operating room. It was all sealed off and locked. And then the instructions had been given to, Robert Cheney and the others to just take your seats in the church and wait. And so that's what Cheney and the others did. They just sat there sort of listening and watching, and nothing was going on. There's just this hymn playing from the phonograph, and the mediums are doing like weird stuff in front of the door, apparently communicating with the doctor, but the whole thing was just sort of absurd. Honestly, Robert didn't really know what to make of this. But when he had caught wind that there was going to be this totally bizarre procedure done, He had come here not to validate that this was a smart or good way to do a surgery, but rather that this would just make a really wild story that people would be interested to read. But the longer Robert sat there listening and watching this totally bizarre scene unfold, the more he felt like he had sort of bitten off more than he could chew, that this was not really worth the time or energy. This was just really, really weird. However, as he's sitting there, sweating in the heat, just sort of waiting for this thing to be over, whatever it was, he overheard a couple of the doctors who were witnesses to this, along the pew with him, talking about Dr. Gomes. And what Robert heard is that these doctors are like, there is no way Dr. Gomes can perform this surgery. Like, he's not capable of performing this surgery. It's not possible. Not to mention, the doctors are also saying that, generally speaking, attempting to perform an appendectomy by yourself with no anesthesia, no nurses, no techs to help, was also just a terrible idea. Let alone, again, Dr. Gomes can't do this. There's no way. And so Robert, after hearing these doctors talk, he started to feel like, oh man, this whole thing's really unsettling. Now it's just creepy. The sound of the hymn and the mediums writhing around, presumably communicating with this famous doctor through the locked door. And it's like, please let this end. This is so awful. And he was just staring over at the mediums and the locked door, and suddenly the mediums just stopped. But Robert just continued to sit there with the other witnesses for over another hour. They've been in there now for 2+ hours, and it's just this horrible scene. But eventually, this booming voice came out of the back room. The doors weren't open yet. The voice was just coming from inside of that room, and the voice yelled that the operation was now over. Robert, at this point, looked over at those two doctors who had sort of voiced their own concerns, and they kind of exchanged a look like, what are we going to see in there? But they had waited this long, they really wanted to see, so they all stood up and they made their way over to the door. When they got to the door, the two mediums stepped out of the way, and then one of the two doctors that was with Robert, they just reached down and tried the door handle, and they found it was now unlocked. And so the lights are on at this point inside the church. This is the first time they're going to see what's inside of this, magical operating room, and they open the door, and the doctors walk in, and Robert follows right behind them, and they look around. And at first, it was just really weird. There was really nothing strange in the room. The patient is right in the middle of the room. He's on an operating table. He has fresh stitches right on his side, suggesting he's just had surgery. And literally next to him on the table is a jar with his appendix sitting inside of it, floating in liquid. The surgery had been a success. The patient was okay. However, there was a catch. The surgeon, the famous surgeon, Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. He was not back here. And the reason is because Dr. Luis Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. And it was because the surgeon was dead that all these people, Robert, the two doctors, the other reporters, it's why they were brought here, to bear witness to this unbelievable thing. Because the people who organized this knew that if they didn't have witnesses, nobody would ever believe that this had happened. Even though a dozen witnesses, including Robert Cheney, those doctors, the other reporters, were there in the church that day, and they swore that no living doctor ever went in that back room. They didn't go in during, before, after the surgery. Nobody came out, even though they swore, basically, that the patient was effectively alone in that room. Despite that, X-rays would confirm that the patient had had an appendectomy on that day, that his appendix really was removed, and apparently it was removed by a very highly skilled surgeon. And so, this remains the only surgery on record to have been officially performed by a ghost. At 5 a.m. on the morning of December 5th, 1957, a 74-year-old woman named Frances Bowles woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco, California. And before she opened her eyes, Frances just had this feeling, this sense, that somebody else was in the room with her. But she wasn't bothered by this because she knew it had to be her husband, Gene. So Gene was 82 years old, and he'd been really, really sick for the past couple of years. And recently, he'd begun sleeping in their guest bedroom, so he wouldn't wake Frances up with all his tossing and turning at night. but then in the mornings, he would often come and join her in bed. And so she's assuming that's what's going on. Gene must have joined me in the middle of the night and he's next to me in bed. However, when Frances did open her eyes, she saw there was someone else in the room, but it was not Gene. So Frances was lying on her side on the edge of the bed, looking outward. And her perspective, from her head, the way she was positioned, is she was sort of looking down towards the ground when she first opened her eyes. And the first thing she saw when she was looking off the side of the bed were these very distinctive shoes standing, with somebody's legs right next to the bed, basically standing facing her. And she sees these old-fashioned polished dress shoes with very thick heels and a piece of gray fabric buttoned over the ankles, like the way men used to wear back in the late 1800s. Like, these are distinctive and old shoes. And it was actually these shoes that immediately gave away that this was not Gene, because Gene did not own a pair of shoes like that. Frances would know. And as her eyes traveled up from these strange shoes, she saw this was clearly a man, and he had skinny legs, and he was wearing black and gray striped pants, and he had a very small body overall, and he was wearing a white vest with a long black coat with coattails. And then as Frances finally reached this man's head, she saw he had these strikingly blue eyes, and he was looking right at her, and he had this almost mocking grin on his face. And Frances has no idea who this person is. There is a stranger in her house. She's thinking he's broken in. What's he gonna do to me? And she just sat up in her bed and she looked at this guy and he leaned forward and he just kind of continued to smile and he said, "I'm here for Gene." Frances just began to scream at the top of her lungs. But this man, this strange little man with blue eyes, just began to laugh. And then, to Frances's total disbelief, he vanished. A second later, Frances heard footsteps, and then the bedroom door flew open, and Gene burst in asking what was wrong. And without thinking, Frances blurted out that there had been somebody in her room. But as she told Gene all about this strange little man and his weird outfit with his blue eyes and how he vanished, she started to realize that what she was saying sounded absurd. And from Gene's expression, she could tell that he did not believe her. He's thinking, you were having a dream, clearly, like there's no way this happened. And so even though to Frances, the experience she had just had felt 100% real, by the time she was done telling the story and sort of going over it with Gene, she was starting to think that, maybe she had like a very lucid, vivid dream. However, just to be safe, Frances and Gene spent a few minutes walking all around the house, making sure nobody else was here, and also looking for, any signs that maybe somebody had broken in, but there were none. However, Gene did find that the front door was unlocked, which definitely was not something he did. He remembered locking the door before bed, and Frances said she never unlocked it, so that was sort of a strange thing. But other than that, the house was in normal order. And so Frances and Gene, they didn't really know what to do. I mean, they did debate calling the police, but they had no evidence that this actually happened, and they both agreed that the story was just too strange for anyone to believe. And so by 7 a.m. that morning, so just a little while after this whole thing happened, Frances felt pretty convinced that there had been no little man in a room with blue eyes, and this really had just been a very lucid, horrible dream. And so the two of them began to go about their normal morning routine when Gene really started to feel sick. I mean, he was already not doing well in the weeks prior, but he really just started to deteriorate really quickly. This is like 15, 20 minutes after this little man has popped up in her nightmare or whatever. Gene starts falling apart, to the point where Frances actually called his doctor and said, "You gotta come here right now. Something's wrong with Gene. He's fallen apart here." By 8 a.m., when the doctor showed up, this is now about an hour after, Frances has had whatever experience she had, whether it was a nightmare or real, they don't know. But this is an hour later, the doctor shows up, and by this point, Gene is like wrecked. He's practically on his deathbed. He's falling apart. He gets rushed to the hospital, and all day that day, they're trying to save him. But by the very next morning, he had died. And then as time went on, whenever she would think about that strange experience, the little man in her room, she would just rationalize it and tell herself that that was just her own mind's way of working out her growing anxiety over Gene's mortality. I mean, after all, he had died literally within 24 hours of that vision. And so maybe that was just her mind's way of getting ready for Jean's death. However, despite telling herself the story and feeling pretty good about that being what this whole thing was, what she could never quite figure out was how her subconscious had created such a strange character with such a weirdly specific wardrobe. She knew she had never seen anybody like that before in her whole life. So how did her mind come up with this really vivid character? But she ultimately just pushed this whole thing out of her mind and didn't talk to anybody about this experience. Well, that is until a few months later. Late one night in the spring of 1958, so a few months after Jean's death, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter, whose name was Jane, were driving down a freeway in Northern California, coming home from a road trip they had taken as sort of a celebration of Jean's life. And so as they're driving along, both women are looking out the window, they're not really talking, and the radio wasn't on, and so the only sound was the sound of the tires on the road. It was just very quiet. But then sort of out of nowhere, Jane spoke up and told her mother about something really weird that had happened to her on the morning of Jean's death. And she couldn't stop thinking about it, and it bothered her so much, she just had to tell her mom. According to Jane, she had woken up on that morning, and standing in her room on the other side was this little man with these strange polished shoes, striped pants, black coat with coattails, and these bright blue eyes, who was looking right at her and grinning. And when Frances heard this, she couldn't believe it. And she blurted out to her daughter that she had never told anybody except for Jean, but on that morning, she had seen the exact same man in her bedroom. And so for the rest of the ride, the mother and daughter just compare notes, talking about the whole experience, exactly what they remember, exactly what he looked like, how they felt, what they thought it meant. And then at some point, towards the end of this sort of revelation they're both having, where they're both realizing they've had this shared experience, Frances says something that catches Jane's attention. Frances says, yeah, and then, right before he vanished, he told me he was here for Jean. And then, your dad died 24 hours later. And Jane, when she heard this, she goes quiet and she looks at her mom and she's like, that's not what he said to me. And Frances is like, what do you mean? What did he say to you? And Jane, she's just looking straight ahead. She's driving and she goes, he said, I'm here for Jane. He was here for me. For a moment, the car just went totally quiet. And neither woman knew what to say. But then Frances was like, well, wait a minute. I know the little man said to me, I'm here for Jean. And then 24 hours later, your dad died. Jean died. And so it sort of seemed like they were connected. And you're saying that the same thing happened to you. You've had the exact same experience as me on the same morning, the same time frame that I know he said, I'm here for Jean. And you think he said, I'm here for Jane? But you're still alive, and that was months ago. You must have just misheard him. He must have said, I'm here for Jean, same as me, and you just thought he said Jane. And so pretty quickly, both women agreed that that had to have been what happened. They had the exact same experience, and in both cases, this guy has said he's here for Jean. Has to be what happened. However, Frances would be wrong. Because on December 7th, 1958, exactly a year and 1 day after Jean died, Frances's daughter, Jane, died as well. It would turn out she had not been perfectly healthy as she and her mother believed when she saw this little man in the strange outfit with the blue eyes. She had had cancer that likely had just cropped up but had gone undetected. And now, by the time doctors were realizing she had it, it was too late. It had spread to the point where there was nothing they could do. Following her daughter's death, Frances was so overcome with grief that she poured her energy into basically just telling everyone she could about this little man that she had seen before her husband's death and her daughter had claimed to have seen before she died. It just felt like, we gotta tell people about this, what happened? And she even ended up writing to a journalist to try to get this story out there, to try to figure out what the heck that was. However, nobody came forward with any sort of meaningful explanation about what this experience was, what it meant, how real it was. No one knew what to make of it. However, after getting the story out there and describing in agonizing detail every little thing that she remembered from this experience, Frances did learn one piece of information that does seem to begin to explain who this little man was. That man's outfit, the old-fashioned dress shoes, the striped pants, the white vest, the black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession. The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker. On the afternoon of July 9th, 2001, a 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen carried a bag of camping supplies through the woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody had come to the woods for a camping trip with his dad and his Boy Scout troop. But about 30 minutes earlier, he had broken off from the main group, they were over at camp, and he had hiked a couple of miles to his dad's truck to pick up some extra camping supplies. And now that he had those supplies, he had turned around and begun hiking back towards the rest of the group. As Cody hiked along, he kind of let his mind wander. He was thinking about what story he was going to tell that night around the campfire to impress the other Boy Scouts. But as he was thinking about it and kind of walking along, he started to realize that things didn't look familiar. And at some point, he started to wonder, why haven't I actually reached the campsite yet? And at that point, he stopped, he didn't panic, and he just kind of looked around and realized that he actually had left the path. He was not even in an area that he had seen before. And so being a Boy Scout, he kind of stayed calm and he just turned around and decided he would retrace his steps back to his dad's truck and start again. He would obviously be very late back to camp, but at least he'd come back in one piece. But as he retraced his steps, he really didn't know where he had come from, because again, he had sort of left the trail because his mind was wandering. And so before long, Cody realized he was totally lost, and he started to panic. Hours passed by as Cody frantically walked around the woods, calling out for help, but not hearing anybody calling back to him. And then as the sun began to set, he also noticed that storm clouds were rolling in. And so this situation was becoming dire very quickly. But he told himself, don't worry, my father and the Boy Scout troop, they clearly know by this point that I'm missing and they must be out looking for me. But Cody knew there was no telling how long it would take for them to find him. I mean, it could be hours or it could be days. Or the thought was totally terrifying, but they might not find him at all. But at this point, Cody was able to calm himself down and tell himself hey, you're a Boy Scout. You can do this. You can at least stay out here, make a shelter, build a fire, and kind of just wait while someone comes to find you. That's all you can do at this point. And so he had his bag of supplies with him, and so he took it off and he dumped the contents out. And quickly he realized the contents of this bag were not going to help him. Certainly not going to help him build a fire or shelter. But worse than that was there also wasn't any food, and he barely had any water. So effectively, he had nothing. And then, of course, to make matters even worse, the sky suddenly let loose, and Cody was caught in a major thunderstorm. And so Cody rounded up whatever he could, threw it in his bag, and just started running in the dark through the trees as hail is pelting him and it's thunder and lightning, and he's got no idea what he's gonna do. And then suddenly lightning flashes across the sky, and for a second the forest is illuminated, and right up ahead of him is this cave. And so Cody runs into the cave and he takes shelter inside of it. It's pouring rain outside. It's so loud, it's so chaotic, and he's terrified. But now it's like his body just shuts down. He's so overwhelmed, he's so scared as he's laying there wondering, am I gonna die out here? That he just closes his eyes and passes out just from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, Cody woke up still sheltering inside of this cave. And the first thing he noticed is when he looked out into the woods was the storm had stopped, the rain had let up. And then the second thing he noticed was he heard the distinct sound of a helicopter flying somewhere nearby. Cody instantly ran out of the cave and looked up into the sky, and sure enough, there was this small helicopter flying around roughly in his area. And so using some of his Boy Scout training, he pulled off his belt and he used the metal buckle of his belt to reflect the sunlight back up at the pilot to get the pilot's attention. And it worked. He got the pilot clearly to notice him, and before long, he noticed the pilot hovering down lower and lower right over the tree line, looking for a place to land. And so Cody is so overjoyed, he's about to be saved. He grabs his stuff and just charges over roughly to the area where the pilot's trying to land, and by the time he gets in that vicinity, he sees the pilot actually touching down in a clearing. Cody can't believe it. It's only been one day and he's been found. And so Cody runs over to the helicopter, throws the door open, gets inside, and the pilot just turns around and says, "Good morning." And Cody, at first, doesn't really register what's happening here. He's only just completely relieved that he is going to survive. But then he kind of stops and looks at the pilot. and he can't believe who it is that's just rescued him. It would turn out the night before, when Cody did not return to the camp, his father and the Boy Scout troop did contact authorities, and before long, a local search party was organized. And one of those people who volunteered to be a part of the search was an amateur pilot who lived in the area. That helicopter pilot was the one who found Cody 10 miles away from his Boy Scout troop's camp. When that pilot reunited Cody with his father, Cody's father naturally assumed that, given the trauma of the last 24 hours, that Cody would not want to rejoin the Boy Scout troop and continue this camping trip, that he would want to go home. But instead, Cody said, no, I want to go back to the Boy Scout troop. I want to sit there and tell them what happened to me, because now I have a campfire story that they are not going to believe. Cody had trekked 10 miles through the wilderness all alone, spent the night with bears out in a cave somewhere in the middle of a storm, and then ultimately got rescued by this amateur helicopter pilot who happened to be, at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. The amateur pilot was the actor who had played Han Solo in Star Wars, he was Indiana Jones, and had starred in several other major blockbuster movies. It was none other than Harrison Ford. You know that feeling when you just get totally immersed and lost inside of a story from start to finish? Well, that's exactly what Audible brings right to you. Whether you're stuck in traffic or hitting the gym or winding down after a long day, Audible always has a story that will bring you right in. Thrillers, fantasies, true crime, you name it, it's all there on Audible, all just a click of a play button away. So go unleash your adventurous side with Audible's vast library of entertainment. Sink into gripping titles that'll keep you guessing all the way to the very end. Also, you can discover exclusive Audible originals that you can't find anywhere else, and be the first to experience exciting new releases from your favorite authors. And if you're looking for a recommendation, maybe check out Mr. Ballin Presents The Graphic Stories. I hear that's a pretty good graphic novel, and they do have a really amazing audiobook. Check that one out. Discover stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your next great adventure awaits with Audible. Start listening today when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Mr. Ballin. Okay, back to the story. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. He coughed and wheezed as he slowly walked down the hall next to other sick kids as they made their way towards the hospital's classroom. Now, Rich didn't know what kind of lesson he and the other kids were going to get today, but frankly, he didn't care. Anything was better than just sitting in his hospital room, bored out of his mind. So Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And over the past 10 weeks, he'd been bouncing around to different hospitals. And in fact, his condition was still so bad that this hospital had informed his parents that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And as awful as this sounded to Rich, this actually was not the first time something like this had happened to him. When he was 6 years old, his appendix burst, and then he contracted an infection that left him in a coma for several weeks. And then when he came out of the coma, he had to recover in a hospital for nearly a year. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. And because his family was not a well-off family, they couldn't afford to hire a tutor to kind of keep Rich up to speed. And so basically at this point, Rich's education consisted of, whatever random classes these hospitals he was staying in sporadically had. Whenever they hired a teacher to come in and teach basket weaving or, shop class, whatever was available, that was his education. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he did not have high expectations about what he would be taught that day. He figured it was just going to be some random class that he would sit through that at least was keeping him out of his hospital bedroom. But the instant he saw the teacher for the day and saw what was surrounding the teacher, he was really excited. Because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. He had seen one day in a Windows shop a drum set and he had wanted it so badly, but his family didn't have the money to pay for it, so he had never had a chance to do it. But now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so when the teacher began handing out the instruments to the kids, Rich demanded that he get the drum set. He would not play anything else. And the teacher was like, okay. And so he was given the drum. And then that day, the teacher led the class, through a couple of basic songs, and Rich played the drum, and he and everybody else were objectively terrible, like the music was awful. But by the end of the class, Rich was totally revitalized here. I mean, he hadn't discovered some special new talent for playing the drums, but he had discovered that he had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. And then also every few weeks, when the music teacher came back to the hospital, Rich would go to those classes and he would try to learn as much as he possibly could from the teacher. And that was basically his whole life, was those classes and banging on everything he could. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, despite having his health back, it isn't like his life suddenly got a whole lot easier. It isn't like, he left the hospital and, magically became this amazing drummer and that was his life. Instead, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. And for Rich, he felt like that was the right thing to do. He didn't resent his family. This is what his life was. And what he did is he found joy, while he was working, in grabbing makeshift drumsticks and just banging on stuff any chance he could. And he figured that that would be his life. He would just work and, find joy in drumming whenever he could. But Rich's outlook on life changed dramatically on Christmas of 1956, so a year after he'd left the hospital. Because on that Christmas, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. To this point, Rich had not been able to have his own drum set. Everything was makeshift. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit, and Rich is like, this is the best gift I've ever been given. And he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off. And before long, he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right as Rich is kind of hitting his stride, being this kind of local celebrity, this local, very popular band fired their drummer. And so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, hey, will you join our band? And Rich said, let's do it. By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles. Around 11 a.m. on Sunday, October 20th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their home in Oakland, California. And the first thing Will noticed as soon as he was awake was the smell of smoke. Will got out of his bed and went to the window, and when he looked out, he could see there was this big plume of smoke coming from what looked like right outside of his neighborhood. And since he lived in California, where wildfires were unfortunately a common reality, he thought that's got to be a wildfire. So Will called 911 to report it, but the dispatcher told him that yes, that is a wildfire. It's on a mountainside, about 600 feet away from Will's house in his neighborhood. But they said the fire department was already all over it, and the smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover, after the fire had been put out. So no real threat here. And so after hearing this, Will's mind was put at ease. He thanked the dispatcher and hung up, and then he went about his normal morning routine. And as he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander towards work. So Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on this video game about ants, like the insects, and how they go about building their homes. And Will was really excited about this game. But as Will left the bathroom and happened to look out the window that he looked out before and saw that plume of smoke out on the mountainside, any thoughts of his video game immediately vanished. Because now he was looking out and he saw this huge cloud of smoke that, in addition to being much bigger, there was also obvious flames licking up. Like, clearly the fire is not extinguished, and worse, it appeared the fire was moving in the direction of his neighborhood, and pretty quickly. And so Will immediately grabs the phone and he calls 911 again, and he reports that, hey, I'm seeing a fire here. And he could tell just from the dispatcher's voice that they were kind of surprised. They felt like the fire was under control. Like, what are you talking about? And so Will realized, like, based on this response, I can't afford to wait for help. I mean, it's unclear if they even know what's going on here, and this fire appears to be moving right towards me. And so after hanging up with the dispatcher, Will knew he had to act. And so Will runs to his wife, who by this point, she's looking out the window too. She's terrified. And they're like, what are we gonna do here? And they decide, we just gotta evacuate. Like, by this point, the fire is literally coming right towards them. The smoke is beginning to overwhelm them. And so they just grabbed a couple of bare necessities. They charged out of their house and they're looking down the street. And again, the smoke by this point is kind of, making it hard to see, but they can see other neighbors are frantically getting in their cars to evacuate as well. And Will and his wife, they're about to speed off when they remember their neighbors had gone away for the weekend and they had left their old parents to look after their 2-year-old kid. And they didn't have a car. And so Will's like, oh my gosh, he runs next door, he pounds on the door, and the grandparents, they come out and they're scared as well. They have the 2-year-old and Will's like, come on. They grabbed a couple of necessities, they hopped in Will's car, and before long, all of them were peeling down the road, evacuating. 1 week later, Will returned to his neighborhood, this time in the passenger seat of a police cruiser, because you needed an official escort to be able to go into this area because of how dangerous it was. There was debris everywhere. When the police officer stopped in front of Will's address and Will got out, he looked at where his house used to be and it was just gone. Like every other house in his neighborhood, it was completely leveled by this fire. That fire burned for 4 days, destroyed thousands of homes, including basically Will's entire neighborhood, and it killed 25 people. Will walked towards the rubble that used to be his home, and as he stood there surveying the area, he was hit with this epiphany. He didn't really care that he had lost all of his things, like everything he owned basically had been destroyed by this fire, but he just didn't care. Instead, all he cared about and all he was grateful for was his family. Like, they had survived, they'd escaped the fire. That's what mattered. And so as he's standing there, sort of a little bit numb to what's happened here, he looked down and he saw ants. Now remember, he was developing this video game about ants, and so had done tons of research about ants. And he saw these ants that definitely were destroyed by this fire as much as the people were. I mean, their colonies were all burnt up and destroyed as well. But he saw these ants, and what they were doing was gathering supplies and rebuilding, brick by brick. That's what they were doing. That's what ants do. They simply go forward and rebuild, no matter the tragedy. And this gave Will an idea. 9 years later, Will finally released his video game. But it was not the game he had been developing, the one about ants. Instead, it was inspired by the ants he saw marching through the rubble after this horrible fire. In this game he made, you could create characters like avatars who could live entire digital lives, complete with homes and neighbors and spouses and kids and friends. Like, it really was an actual universe in this game. But this game is not set in a perfect fantasy world. Instead, the universe that these characters live inside of is meant to mimic the real world that we live in, where tragedies can strike, and often do, sort of unpredictably. Death, destruction, wildfires, you name it, that's just kind of part of living in this world. And so in this game, characters periodically would just have horrible things happen to them, and they would have to rebuild, just like the ants had to rebuild, and just like Will and his family and everybody else affected by that fire. You just have to move forward and rebuild. Will's game wound up being a massive success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide, and today hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people still play it. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful.
And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7, not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her. And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear, not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up. Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her, and they could play together. And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on, and then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody. And then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was, and Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But, as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silvera, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silvera, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the Cartel Sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's gonna be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in this city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of the story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the cartel sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name. That is a pseudonym to protect her identity. Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos and every week you anxiously wait a new upload? If so, thank you. But also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the Mr. Ballin Podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the Mr. Ballin Podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. So that's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms, well, there's only one place you can do that, and that's on Amazon Music. So again, you can go to any podcast platform and find the Mr. Ballin Podcast, or if you're like me and you hate waiting, then you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. On January 23rd, 1989, a mother was cooking dinner in her home in Rochester, New York, when her 11-year-old daughter came into the kitchen. The daughter had just finished delivering newspapers along her delivery route in their quiet suburban neighborhood, and so her mother asked her the same nightly question: how was the route? And usually the daughter replied with just a good, but tonight was different. Instead, her daughter said, "It's okay." And the mother pried, like, "Well, what do you mean? What happened?" And the daughter said, "Well, I saw something strange." She told her mom that she delivered newspapers to this one particular old man. He was very nice and he always waved to her whenever she went by. And tonight was no different. He had waved to her, but there was just something off about the way he was sitting. The mother asked, what do you mean? And the daughter, she really struggled to articulate what she had seen. 1, it was dark. 2, the man was sitting inside of a screened-in porch that kind of obscured her view, and the awnings were pretty low, making it hard to look in. But she said basically when she had gone past, the man had waved to her like normal, but his legs appeared to be straight up in the air, like he was sitting on a chair and his legs were like up, vertical, right in front of him. In fact, when he waved, it was like he was waving between his legs at her. And so when the mother heard this, she really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, the story didn't make any sense. She couldn't really understand how this guy was sitting where his legs would be straight up in the air like that. But at the same time, she could tell her daughter was worried, and, she kind of figured that maybe her daughter's imagination had run wild here. And so she told her daughter, like, "Hey, look, if he waved to you, then I'm sure everything is just fine. Don't worry about it." But the following night, when the girl came back from her route once again, she was even more upset about this guy out on his porch. She told her mom that once again, she looked in the porch and there he was sitting there with his legs straight up in the air, except this time he didn't wave to her, including when she made a point to stop and wave at him. He did not wave back. Now, the girl told her mom that she was worried about him, and so she went right up to the door to go check on him, but the screened-in porch was locked, so she couldn't get inside, and her view was kind of obscured because of the screen, so she couldn't really see him in there. But, she didn't know what to do, so she just left. Now, this story, which was already weird, now did seem a whole lot weirder that 2 days in a row her daughter is seeing this. But the mother's thinking to herself, like, come on, this is just some older guy who loves this chair and, he's fallen asleep in some weird position here. And, my daughter's sort of exaggerating what she's seeing. Like, this can't be a big deal here. But again, seeing the concern on her daughter's face, she told her daughter, look, don't worry about it. I'm sure everything's fine. I will go by tomorrow morning and make sure he's okay. So the next morning, a little before 11 a.m., the mother arrived on the street where this old man lived. And as she was walking down the road towards the house, she actually spotted the mailman. And so before she went any farther, she flagged the mailman down and she asked him, like, hey, is there anything weird going on with that old guy who lives right over there? But the mailman was like, no, he's just a nice older guy who waves at everybody who goes by. And so the mother thanked the mailman and did give some thought to just, taking what the mailman said and turning back around and heading home and telling her daughter everything's fine. But, she knew her daughter was really worried about this guy, and so she decided she would just continue down the road and check on this guy for herself and just really make sure he's okay, and then report back to her daughter. And also the mother was thinking, it's about 20 degrees outside. It's very cold. This is not really a good time for an older man to be outside so much. So what's he doing? Like, let's really make sure he's okay. And so the mother made her way down the road and she reached the old man's house. And sure enough, the screened-in porch really did obscure, whoever was inside of it. She could see a silhouette of what appeared to be this old man sitting there. But the first thing she actually noticed was not him, but rather the 2 newspapers that were sitting right on his walkway, uncollected. I mean, these are the newspapers that her daughter had left over the same period of time that she's seeing this weird thing happening with this guy. And so suddenly the woman's feeling like that's a pretty big red flag. And so she hustled her way right up towards the front. And as she did, she looked into the screen porch and waved at this old man to try to get his attention. Like, hey, are you okay in there? But the man did not wave back. And so the mother went right up to the door and she checked it. But like her daughter had said, it was locked. And so the mother, she pressed her face up against the mesh screen that kind of had been obscuring her view from a distance. And she put her face right up against the screen where she would have a clear view inside. And when she did, and she saw the old man who was in fact right there, and he did in fact have his legs up, when she saw him, she realized what was actually going on. And the second she did, she jumped back, turned around, and ran away to go call the police. It would turn out the old man who lived there, whose name was Robert Ham, and he was 73 years old, he was not just eccentric and sitting weirdly on his front porch. Instead, on January 23rd, right before that little girl had come home and told her mother that this man had been acting strangely, on that evening, Robert had come out onto his screened-in porch. And for whatever reason, he had attempted to sit down on this trash can that was out there on the porch. But the lid didn't hold. And so Robert fell butt first into this trash can, folding him up into this V position where his legs were straight up in front of him. And Robert was too weak to get himself out of the trash can. And also because of being in this V position where his legs were pressed up against his torso, it was restricting his ability to breathe and to make any sound. And so all he could do in this position was just wave at passerby, hoping they would see he was in trouble and go help him. But unfortunately, nobody could really tell what he was doing, including the little girl on the paper route. They just thought there was this guy sitting in his porch in this weird position, waving to people, when in reality, he was dying. And so unfortunately, because nobody came to his aid, Robert did die. He would die of a heart attack, and in fact, by the time that little girl's mother arrived at his house and put her face up against the screen, Robert was already dead. At around 7:30 a.m. on September 25th, 2012, a 69-year-old farmer named Terry Garner stepped out of his house in rural Oregon to go feed his animals. He stopped first at his enclosed yard, where he spread some seed on the ground for his chickens and turkeys, and then he headed over to his pen, where he was raising 4-horned goats, which are goats that grow 4 horns instead of 2. And after picking up some hay and tossing it in with the goats, Terry just stood there and smiled as he watched the animals eat. Terry loved his animals. He actually had previously been a butcher for most of his life. But 6 years earlier, when he had retired, he had kind of gone the opposite direction, basically housing all these animals and treating them basically like people. In fact, he was so devoted to his animals that sometimes when the nearby river would flood, he would move all of his animals into this house he had built on his property just for the animals to make sure they were safe. And if you ever went to visit Terry at his property, it was pretty common to see a lot of the chickens and other birds just kind of hanging out on the front porch of Terry's house. He didn't care. He liked having them around. But of all the creatures that Terry took care of at his farm, the animal he loved the most were his pigs. Now, normally when farmers raise pigs, they grow them to about 250 to 300 pounds, and then they sell them to butchers to be slaughtered. But that's obviously not what Terry was doing here. He loved these pigs so much that he basically just fed them anytime they were hungry, and they were hungry all the time, which meant his pigs sometimes grew to be like 700 pounds, and at no point was Terry going to sell those pigs. He just wanted his pigs to live their best life. So on this morning, after he was done feeding his chickens and turkeys and the goats, he grabbed a whole bunch of food and began making his way over to his beloved pigs. A few hours later, a member of Terry's family arrived at Terry's property and knocked on his door. This family member had called Terry earlier in the day and Terry hadn't picked up. Now that in and of itself was not that uncommon. Terry was a busy farmer, but Terry always called people back. And so far he hadn't. And so this family member was here just to check on him and make sure he was okay. And so after a few minutes, when Terry did not come to the door, the family member grew more concerned about Terry and decided they would just walk the whole property and just go find Terry and see what he was doing. And so the family member left the porch and walked all around the property. They saw where the chickens and turkeys were. They saw the goats. They saw the pigs. But that was it. All they saw were animals. Terry was nowhere to be found. It was like he was gone. And so the family member was just about to turn around and head back to Terry's house to see if, maybe he really was in there, when suddenly something caught their eye in the pig pen. Now, at first, what they were looking at just seemed impossible. Like, how could that be there? That doesn't make any sense. But when the family member walked over and got a closer look, they knew for sure what they were looking at. And as soon as that truth sunk in, they turned, ran to the house, and called the police. It would turn out, earlier that morning, when Terry had walked into the pig pen to feed his beloved enormous pigs, somehow or another, he had wound up on the ground. Now, we don't know if he had a heart attack or if he had some other medical event or if he simply just tripped and couldn't get up again, but one way or another, he wound up on the ground, and at some point, his pigs devoured him. And so what that family member saw in the mud that caught their eye was not Terry, but Terry's false teeth grinning back at him. Those teeth, along with several pieces of his body and his clothes, were all that was left of Terry. One more haunting detail of this case is that officials were not able to actually figure out whether or not Terry was dead before he began being eaten, or if he was just sort of incapacitated and very much alive when his beloved pigs began to eat him. As many of you may already know, by far the most popular series that I do on our YouTube channel is the Top 3 Places You Can't Go and People Who Went There Anyways series. So we're going to continue to do that series periodically on YouTube like we have for years. But because this series is so in demand, we are also going to begin telling these stories in a brand new format, audio. Right now, you can head over to the Mr. Ballin podcast on any podcast platform to find one of these exclusive episodes. The way you find them is you look in the title of the episode, and if it says "You Can't" at the front of the episode, that is this type of content. And so right now, there's an episode that's live, and periodically we're going to populate more You Can't style episodes on that podcast. The only reason we are not full sending this You Can't series on audio as a standalone show is because we need to gauge the interest on audio before we kind of ramp that up. That's why you're seeing kind of periodic uploads. So if you really want to hear more of this stuff, go listen to that You Can't episode and tune in each time we tell you there are You Can't episodes available. And if there's lots of demand, you'll see more You Can't style episodes, which again are very, very similar to the Top 3 Places You Can't Go and People Who Went There Anyways. So right now, go over to Mr. Ballin Podcast and have a listen to the first You Can't episode. Enjoy.